So now we're on to service level management, which you could argue is probably the most important process within ITIL. And the reason for that is because the output from service level management is service level agreements. So the purpose is to make sure that we align what we're providing in terms of functionality, performance, etc., with what the business needs. That's defined in the service level agreement that says for each customer which services they're going to take and what level of performance they need for those services, and things like availability as well that we'll talk about in a moment. Now think about this, why is that document so valuable? Why is the SLA so valuable? Well, from a customer perspective, having an SLA with their service provider ought to provide them with confidence that the service provider is interested in and committed to delivering against those services and service levels. So it's a degree of confidence and reassurance that they're going to get what they need. From the service provider's perspective, the value of an SLA is almost inestimable. Think about this, your job is to provide services to your customers. The SLA is the description of which customers require which services at which service level. That should inform everything that IT does. And one could argue, if you're doing something that isn't aligned to meeting or delivering a service or service level, why are you doing it? Because that's the ultimate objective of IT. There's more to it than that. From a service provider's perspective, it prevents the service provider from being asked to meet unreasonable requirements. Classically, you'll get a part of the organisation decides to relocate from one environment to another, one office to another, and they'll typically tell IT on Friday, could they have the new office reconfigured for the network but over the weekend, despite the fact they've been planning that for 3 months. We might get examples where a user expects to submit multiple transactions per second from multiple users. Normally we can manage that, but if those transactions go above a certain level, clearly they're going to impact on the capacity of our network and our applications in order to be able to meet that service level. So the SLA does protect us from unreasonable requests. It also sets the expectation of the customer that we can do most things with sufficient notice. Key elements of service level management are that we need to be able to document and agree what we're going to provide. We need to be able to measure and report that. It's pointless having a commitment that you can't measure or report if you think about it. And that itself forms the basis of not only validating that we're meeting the requirement, but looking for potential improvement. So it feeds continual service improvement. If we get this right, we will build better relationships with our customers and our business users. We will improve customer satisfaction, and it does help us understand where there's potential to make improvements, both in terms of service delivery and cost. The core concepts within service level management that allow us to do this, and the start point, if you like, is understanding customers' service level requirements. Now, ITIL says these should be documented. And what you should do is go and talk to your customers and understand their requirements and document those. You might argue, if you've done that, why can't that become the SLA? And the simple answer is because quite often the requirements customers have is either not deliverable or not deliverable at this stage, or not feasible or not part of what we want to deliver. And so the role associated with this process, namely the service level manager, their job is to understand what those requirements are and then take those requirements back into IT and dialogue with their colleagues, typically in availability, capacity, finance, for instance. Is this something we can do? Is it something we're capable of? Is it consistent with our strategy? Do we need to engage third parties? And ultimately, when can we deliver it and what will it cost? We then take that message back to our business partner and say, we can do this. It'll cost this much, it'll take that long. And then there's typically some iteration until ultimately we agree what's actually going to be provided, that then goes into the SLA and then is signed by both parties as effectively a commitment by both to making that happen. We mentioned about operational level agreements. This is managing the internal supply chain to make sure that the teams that are needing to work together in order to deliver the service and meet these commitments understand their respective responsibilities. We reference again contracts here because Interestingly, up till 2007, the management of suppliers and the contracts with them was part of service level management. That's now been separated out into a new process that we're going to touch on in a moment called Supplier Management, and that recognises that pretty much every IT service provider is dependent to one extent or another on third-party suppliers. The reason it's referenced here is because the contracts with the suppliers need to cross-reference and underpin the agreements we have with customers. To take an example of this, we may well have a commitment to our business to provide them with pre-configured laptops for use by business users. Clearly, we're not building the laptop, we're configuring it but acquiring it from a third-party provider. So we need a contract with that provider that says if we've made a commitment to deliver a configured laptop to a user within, let's say, 7 days, then we need the frame from the supplier within perhaps 3 days. If we don't get it within 3 days, we don't get the time to do the configuration and send it out to the customer within 7 days. And it's quite remarkable how often we go to organisations and ask whether anyone has validated that the contracts with the suppliers underpin the agreements we have with customers and get a blank look because no one's actually validated that. And yet now you can see quite clearly if we haven't done that, then we're almost setting ourselves up to fail. However, the management of those contracts, as I said, is the accountability of supplier management. The reason it's in service level management is because the responsibility for the alignment is shared, even though the accountability is separate. The service provider, we've mentioned, it's a term that we use to mean the organisation that's providing the IT services. The supplier in ITIL terms is the third party. It's an external organisation on which we depend for certain services. If we want to make things better, either reactively or proactively, then ITIL says we need a service improvement plan, sometimes called a service improvement programme. The difference is a plan is typically constituted for a specific objective at a point in time, whereas a programme is a rolling, ongoing set of improvements into which we put improvements with specific objectives, but there's an overall programme. And then, as I mentioned, whatever we commit to in the service level agreements, we have to measure and report. And although ITIL tries to tell us that that's what needs to be done, not how to do it, it does offer two ways of reporting. One is using what it calls Service Level Agreement Monitoring Charts, SLAM charts. The other is referred to as RAG reports, which I'm sure most of you recognise as red, amber, green, in terms of whether we missed the service level, whether it was compromised or whether we met it. And they're the key concepts in service level management. But again, I can't stress enough, this is an absolutely key process because ultimately it delivers the service level agreements that we focus almost entirely our efforts on in terms of meeting in order to achieve what our customers need from IT, but also to provide a basis of understanding how we can do that better. Let's look now at availability management. This is a design process, the purpose of which is to ensure that we understand and build into our solution, be it new or changed, the availability requirements. And we'll look at those specific requirements in a moment. But again, clearly this is a strong proactive approach that says, having understood what our client's specification is in terms of availability, how do we deliver or design a solution to meet that? Often easier than it sounds. That solution needs to be fit for purpose, not just now, but in the future, in fact, over the life of the service. But, as we mentioned before, like most other processes, this is not just relevant to design, it's also relevant to operation, in that when the service fails or becomes unavailable or starts running slowly, we need to engage availability management to understand why. If we look at the components of availability management, we see that there's potentially 4 elements to this. Firstly, we've got availability itself. And what we mean by availability has 2 dimensions. Firstly, the availability of the components, the technology components that are necessary to support the service. These are things like the network, the application, the server, etc. All the technology components that have to be up and running for the service to be usable by the end customer. And that hints at the second aspect of availability, which is from a customer perspective. So we're managing the component availability with the intention of providing end-to-end user availability of the service. Now, an example of that would be if the service was due to be available this week for 100 hours and we lost that service for 8 hours, then our availability was 92% of the contracted service level. So that's the first measure of availability. The second measure of availability is reliability, which is defined as the mean time between incidents or failures or the average uptime. And this is also an important aspect for a customer because it's not just is it available, it's how long is it likely to be available before it's going to fail. So again, to take an example, if last year the payroll service suffered 12 outages, then the average uptime was a month. Even if the outages all occurred in February and September, 12 outages over a year is an average of a month before the service fails. So that's reliability. The third measure of availability is maintainability. And maintainability is defined as mean time to restore a service, otherwise colloquially referred to as average downtime. So again, in our example, if we take the fact that the payroll service suffered 12 outages last year, if those outages totaled 72 hours downtime, then the average outage was 6 hours each. And together those represent the dimensions of availability in which customers are interested: availability, reliability and maintainability. The fourth measure, serviceability, describes the commitment of a third party or their ability to meet the terms of the contract in respect of the other three. So it's not a different measure, it's a composite measure of the other three. So essentially, again, we're talking availability, reliability and maintainability. And if we give those responsibilities to a third party, it's together measured as serviceability. Now, we mentioned supplier management a little bit earlier when we talked about service level management. And the purpose of supplier management is to manage suppliers, the contracts with them, and get the best value from those contracts. And so given that pretty much every IT organisation now is dependent on one or more suppliers and typically many more, then we have a whole process for managing those suppliers. But clearly this process manages the suppliers in concert with the management of the customers and the service level agreements in the way I described before, where if we're the service provider and we're dependent on buying services in from a supplier, then the contract with that supplier needs to underpin the agreement we have with our customer. You see reference here to a supplier policy. You remember from the generic process diagram that every process should have a policy. This is the first one we've seen specifically. What this talks about is that the supplier policy is our organisation's way of describing our way of managing different suppliers. And what ITIL recommends is that suppliers are categorised into one of four categories. These categories are based on two dimensions. It's the value or importance of what the supplier is providing and the risk or impact of that supply being disrupted or interrupted. And where the value is high and the risk is high, ITIL says they're a strategic supplier. Typically a strategic supplier would be your ISP, maybe your network provider. At the opposite end of that scale, a supplier that's providing something that's low value and low risk would be considered a commodity supplier. And in that case, we're typically going to buy on one factor alone, and that's price. We aren't going to buy services from a strategic supplier based purely on a cost decision. The two categories in between commodity and strategic are tactical and operational. And the policy that we define will describe our organisation's way of managing those suppliers depending on which category they fall into. So, for instance, before we engage a strategic supplier, the policy would say we have to go to open tender. We have to evaluate at least 3 possible suppliers. We evaluate suppliers by looking at their financial profile. We do a company's house search. We take references. We want to go and see other organisations where that supplier has delivered a good service. We will want a contract with that supplier. We will want a named account manager. We will want penalty clauses. We will want regular service review meetings with them, none of which I'd suggest we'd want with a commodity supplier, although of course you could. So the policy again describes how we would manage our suppliers based on where they are in that category. But essentially the role of supplier management, the process and implicitly the role associated with it, the supplier manager, is to manage the contracts and the suppliers that we have those contracts with. And then you see reference to one of 4 management information systems that ITIL recognises, the Supplier and Contract Management Information System. The other 3 you won't see on these slides. One is the Availability Management Information System, the Capacity Management Information System, and the Security Management Information System. And these are critical management systems that contain the information about those respective processes and the people and contracts associated with them. Service asset and configuration management is actually a transition process. Never quite sure why it's in transition. Clearly it has relevance across the rest of the life cycle. And it describes 2 things. It describes asset management and configuration management. Now let's unpick that. An asset in IT terms could be a piece of hardware like a PC. It could be a person. It could be a document. It could be a piece of software. These are our assets and we need to record them, manage them, look after them, optimize them, etc. and control them. Configuration management is something different. Whereas asset management tends to be a financial term and talks about managing the asset, and so for instance if we had a computer, the sort of information we want to record about that asset would be when did we buy it, how much did we pay for it, what's the model number, what's the serial number, what does it weigh, what power does it consume, what heat does it generate, where is it located, when do we need to replace it, who maintains it. All that is asset management. Configuration management critically is separated by one key word, relationships. And those relationships exist at 2 levels. It's the relationship between the assets and between the assets and the services they support. So if we talk about the relationship between the assets, for instance, if we take a desktop PC, we've potentially got 3 assets there, or have we? We've got the screen, we've got the keyboard, and we've got the base unit. Now, should that be 1 asset or should it be 3? The relationship is that they're connected together. They're dependent on each other. The answer as to whether it's 1 device or 3, or 1 asset or 3, is quite simply, it's up to you. If you manage it as a single device or asset, it's 1 asset. In other words, if you get a report about a broken computer and you turn up and the screen's cracked and you take away the screen, the keyboard and the base unit, that's 1 asset. However, if that broken PC turns out to be a corrupted hard drive within the base unit and you replace the hard drive, then you're going to need a separate configuration record for the hard drive within the base unit. Again, how you do this is up to you. And again, where you would document this is in your asset and configuration management policy. The critical aspect of asset and configuration management really is the extent to which, or the way we document how those assets underpin the services that we provide. So when we talked earlier about for a service to be available, the application needs to be available, that's an asset. The server on which it sits needs to be available, another asset. The database it accesses needs to be available, a third asset. The network over which it's delivered, which is probably multiple assets because we've got a local area network either end and a wide area network in the middle. Our ability to document and understand those relationships is critical to almost every other process in ITIL. So for instance, if we're making a change to one or more of those assets, we need to understand what the impact of that change would be on any service that uses those assets. Exactly the information that's held in the configuration management system. Sad but true, this is the least mature process in any organisation. The reason for that, despite the fact that it's necessary, is because of the challenge not only of understanding what assets we have and recording them, but actually keeping that up to date. Because people have a habit of moving those assets, upgrading them, replacing them, taking them away, without keeping the record up to date. If we think about this from an incident management perspective, good practice is when a user rings the service desk to report an incident, you ask them the device they're using to access the service. That's got a badge number on it or an asset tag. You key that asset tag into your system, it tells you not only what that asset is, but what services it uses and what devices and assets it needs to connect to be able to use that service. That's a very useful source of information about the possible source of that incident, both for incident management and problem management, for root cause analysis. So you can begin to see the criticality of this process, but the pity of it is, as I said earlier, it's one of the least mature ones. but it really does underpin just about every other process. The main concepts within asset and configuration management: the configuration item. This is the atomic level of IT, the lowest level of information you want to record, or the lowest level of asset you want to keep information about, based on what your policy is, be it the computer or the screen or even the hard drive within the base unit. The information we hold about that asset goes into the configuration record. Those records sit on one or more configuration management databases, and the information about how they relate to each other is held in a configuration model to show how they're connected. Together, that forms the configuration management system, and that's arguably one of the most important systems in IT. The attributes and characteristics we hold are the information that we hold in the configuration record about each configuration item. And then there's reference to the definitive media libraries that we're going to touch on when we look at release and deployment management. But essentially, the definitive media library is where we hold master copies of software, which of course is another asset, prior to releasing them. And lastly, we've got the concept of a configuration snapshot and a slightly different version called a baseline that says we take a view at a point in time, typically before we make a change, as to what we've got prior to making the change, potentially so we can roll back to a known working state. So a baseline is typically prior to making a change. It can also be the standard build or the position we've reached when we first built a service. But the concept of the baseline has a number of uses. Change management is one of what ITIL calls the 4 major processes, the others being service level management, incident management and problem management. And change management is a vast area. It's naturally, I suppose, a transition process because it's dealing with some form of change. The definition you can see on the slide, the addition, modification or removal of anything that could affect a service. Think about that, anything that could affect a service. So think about what's the smallest and the largest change you could think of. So for me, perhaps one of the smallest changes I can think of would be changing a full stop to a comma in a document, changing a register from 0 to 1. Anything like that is a change. And the biggest change maybe you could think of, apart from introducing a new service, would actually be outsourcing the whole of IT to a new managed service provider. Everything in between, all of those and everything in between, is a change. And typically, as ITIL says, the only changes out of scope of change management would be changes to non-production environments like test environments. However, that's optional, and again it depends on your change policy whether or not you consider those to be in scope. So the purpose of change management is to be able to respond to changing requirements that might come from the business or might come from internal opportunities for improvement or might come from regulatory bodies. But we need to be able to manage those changes and minimise the risks associated with them. And our ability to do that means that what we've got to do for every change is all the verbs under those objectives: record, evaluate, authorise, prioritise, etc., each change. So we're talking about a massive area here and potentially a big process. And so let's look at how we manage that effectively by chunking it. So on that second bullet on this slide, ITIL recognises 3 types of change. We've got normal change, standard change and emergency change. Now, I guess most of you are going to be familiar with the concept of emergency change, but let's just check that out, because emergency change is typically made in response to 2 conditions. One would be a major incident, which requires some kind of emergency change to restore service. The other would be a potential security threat that we need to put in a patch or something to protect against that. Emergency change is not urgent change. ITIL doesn't recognise urgent change. And so ideally we'd be looking at a relatively small number of emergency changes. I'd suggest even 1 a month is probably too many. 2 or 3 a year, ideally. The next 2 changes, normal change and standard change, a little bit challenging in terms of the language. What's the difference between normal and standard? Well, we have to take the ITIL definitions. A standard change is a standard change if it meets 2 preconditions. 1, it needs to be pre-authorised. Think about that. That means IT doesn't have to say yes or no. The person who's making the change request has already authorised that change. Typically things like, can I have a new PC? I'd like to onboard a new starter and set them up with a user ID and password. I'd like to upgrade my software, add a few extra licenses. In practice, most changes are standard changes. The second precondition after being pre-approved is we need a documented procedure for managing that change. This is the interesting bit. If the change meets those two preconditions, it's pre-authorised and we have a procedure for dealing with it, what ITIL then says is we can deal with that as a service request. And typically we deal with service requests using the request fulfillment process. So given that probably 99% of all changes in an organisation are actually standard changes, we've now separated those out from change management and put them through request fulfillment. And what we're left with is normal changes. And normal changes are managed through the Change Advisory Board. And typically, from my experience in organisations, there's one Change Advisory Board meeting a week, maybe two, typically midweek. And typically there's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 changes to assess. These are changes that have the potential to disrupt services. Just going back to standard changes for a moment, once we've defined what a standard change is, and again that's what would we put in our change management policy, where we would typically document those changes that we can list or offer as a standard change would be the service catalogue. That would be the obvious place to put, for the benefit of our users, a definition of what we could treat as a standard change. Normal changes are managed by the submission of a request for change. And the request for change would typically contain the information about what needs to be changed, when it needs to be changed, why it would be changed, all the information that the Change Advisory Board or the CAB needs to be able to assess and either approve, reject or defer that change. Every change, or at least every normal change and emergency change, says ITIL, needs to be tested and have a remediation plan. Used to be called a back out plan. We recognise now from various circumstances that you can't always back out. So the remediation plan says, what do we do if it goes wrong? And those need to be created before we approve the normal or emergency change. One of the main deliverables from the change management process is the change schedule. This is the schedule of forthcoming changes that we post typically on the intranet to advise people what's going to be changed, particularly if it's going to take a service out when it would otherwise be available. And associated with that is the projected service outage that says as a result of this change being made, this service may be either disrupted or partially disabled for this period of time. If you think about the change schedule and projected service outage, in real life that would be when you go onto a station at the weekend, it will give a notification of engineering works and alternative services like bus services replacing rail routes. That's the equivalent. And in ITIL terms, the change model, as is any model in ITIL, is simply a procedure which we would need, for instance, to associate with a standard change. So they're the building blocks of the change management process, and that shows how, although change is potentially a vast area, we can manage it by chunking change into normal, standard or emergency, and again, standard changes taken out and managed as service requests.